The year was 1845, and the air above Montgomery was thick with the scent of iron and magnolia. They said it was just another summer storm that night, but those who were awake remember something else. They remember the sound, not thunder, not wind. Something like a hymn sung backward, rising from the widow's chapel on the hill. By dawn the chapel doors were sealed shut. No one saw Mistress Margaret Beauregard for 3 days. The house slaves whispered that she'd lost her mind, again, that grief had driven her deeper into her private rituals. But that morning, as the overseer called the field hands to work, the chapel floor was bleeding. Thick, dark fluid ran from beneath the threshold, seeping into the soil like veins reaching for the river. Inside, no body was ever found. Only a dress, white once, now rusted brown, and a circle carved into the floor, its lines etched with such precision they seemed burned into the wood. One of the slaves, Ruth, claimed she saw something move inside that circle, something crawling, soundless, head bowed as if in prayer. The others said she was delirious, until she began waking every night at the same hour, humming that same backward hymn. The sheriff came, the church elders came, all left pale and wordless. Records from that week vanished from Montgomery's courthouse. The widow was never charged, never exorcised, never mourned. Her wealth bought her silence. But silence, as the slaves learned, is not the absence of sound. It is the place where sound begins to rot. They say the mansion still stands, buried under vines and rotwood, the chapel door still sealed with rusted iron. And if you press your ear to the earth after midnight, when the wind stops moving, you might still hear that hymn whispering through the soil, waiting to be sung again. Montgomery in those years was a city wearing perfume over decay. The markets gleamed with imported sugar and velvet, but behind every parlor curtain was a whisper. About death, about money, about the Beauregard widow whose house refused to rest. Her mansion rose on Clayborne Hill, overlooking the river where slave ships once anchored. Built from the bones of its own history, every brick had been fired in the labor of the enslaved, men whose names never reached paper. The land itself was old, older than any map. Before the Beauregards claimed it, Creek elders called it the ground that remembers, a place where no roots would grow straight. After her husband, Colonel Thomas Beauregard, died under uncertain circumstances, choked by a fever, according to the family physician, Margaret became the wealthiest widow in Alabama. But wealth in Montgomery was a veil. It covered what festered underneath. She stopped attending services at St. Paul's, dismissed half her servants, and spent her nights in the mansion's rear chapel, a place once meant for worship, now barred to everyone but her. Slaves spoke of strange deliveries brought in wagons at dusk, barrels, boxes, sometimes live animals that never came out again. They said the air around the chapel grew heavy, that insects would die mid-flight, that the dogs refused to cross its path. The widow herself began wearing black even in the heat, her hands gloved to hide what she called the stains of devotion. When a visitor asked her if she still prayed, she replied, "Every night, sir, but not to the one you mean." And yet Montgomery's finest continued to dine at her table. They whispered their unease over brandy and smoked meat, pretending her eyes did not follow the walls, pretending not to hear the faint music drifting from the locked chapel long after midnight. They said she was lonely. But the slaves knew better. She was never alone in that house. They said the widow Beauregard stopped speaking the night her husband was buried. The funeral had been grand, a parade of black carriages and silver-threaded veils. Yet when the last mourner left, she simply turned, closed the door, and blew out every candle in the house. The slaves watched from the quarters as the great mansion went dark, one flame at a time. For 3 nights she ate nothing. On the 4th, A faint glow appeared from the chapel windows. The air carried a new sound, low, rhythmic, and wet. Ruth, the housemaid assigned to bring her meals, said the widow stood barefoot before the altar, her gown streaked with mud, her fingers wrapped in linen. In the center of the chapel lay a coffin, still sealed. She whispered to it, not in English or Latin, but in a language that made Ruth's ears ring and her stomach turn. Every word felt older than the walls that contained them. On the seventh night, the servants found the coffin lid open, the interior lined not with silk, but with river clay and feathers. Her husband's body was gone. In its place lay a book, thick, hand-bound and wet as though just lifted from the water. The title was unreadable. The widow called it the Testament of Rejoining. From that day she forbade anyone from entering the chapel. The windows were covered in black cloth. She began sleeping on the floor, her hands always clasped, her voice always whispering to something that was not there. They say she no longer wore her wedding ring. Instead, a thin band of woven hair circled her finger. Human, not hers. One evening, Ruth heard her speaking again, louder this time. "Do not abandon me. You are the marrow in my blood." When Ruth told the overseer, he warned her never to repeat it, because that night every mirror in the house cracked from the inside. By August of 1845, the mansion had become a wound on the hill, beautiful from afar, rotting up close. The slaves began to dread nightfall, for the house no longer slept. When the clock struck 12, faint hymns drifted through the trees, carried on windless air. The voices were wrong. Too many, too close, breathing between syllables like lungs filled with water. They said the widow no longer walked the halls but glided. Her steps made no sound. The dogs would bark and then fall silent, their tails tucked, their eyes fixed on something unseen near the stairwell. The chapel's windows, once bright with stained glass, now leaked a dim crimson glow. Slaves assigned to clean the yard began leaving small offerings by the back steps, tobacco, coins, even locks of hair, begging whatever haunted the house to pass them by. One woman swore she saw a figure in the garden, kneeling in the soil, burying something that writhed. The widow's voice began to echo through the corridors at strange hours, reciting verses from no scripture known in Alabama. The flesh is but the gate. Through blood, the spirit remembers its shape. Sometimes she was not alone when she spoke. The second voice, lower, strained, and childlike, replied to her. Ruth started marking the days on the cellar wall with chalk, praying each sunrise meant survival. But even the sun seemed dimmer now. The trees around the property stopped blooming. Birds nested elsewhere. One night, the overseer caught sight of the chapel door half open. Inside, candles burned in perfect rows. In their light, he saw symbols, drawn across the walls in soot and salt, spirals, crosses turned backward, eyes with no pupils. And standing before the altar, the widow raised her arms, her face tilted upward, not in prayer but in listening, because something, somewhere deep beneath the chapel, was beginning to answer. The house slaves were forbidden to speak of the noises anymore, but fear has its own language, one that passes through glances and tremors. By autumn, the mansion's wood began to creak with every breath of wind, as though something beneath it was shifting. Ruth, who slept in the narrow attic above the widow's quarters, began waking at the same hour each night, just before 1. At first she thought it was the storm. Then she realized it wasn't thunder. It was chanting, faint, rising from below the floorboards. One morning, as she scrubbed the hallway near the east wing, her brush caught on a crack in the oak planks. A small splinter came loose, revealing a carved mark beneath. A circle surrounded by 3 crescents, each filled with tiny, deliberate cuts. The edges were dark as though scorched from below. When she touched it, her hand began to tremble violently. She ran to the others, but when they returned, the mark was gone. The floor looked smooth, too smooth, like new wood grown overnight. That night, she dreamed of the same symbol, burning on her palm. When she woke, the mark was faintly visible there, a red outline that would not fade. 2 days later, a boy named Isaiah was sent to repair a loose board near the chapel door. He pried it up and screamed. Beneath it, the earth was black and wet, packed with feathers and teeth, all arranged around another of the same symbols. The air reeked of something sweet, spoiled and human. The widow appeared moments later, calm as the grave. "Seal it," she whispered. "This house remembers its shape." By dawn, the boy was gone. They said he ran away, but Ruth swore she heard his voice that night, humming beneath her floor, keeping rhythm with her heartbeat. And when she pressed her ear to the board, something knocked back. By late September, whispers spread through the quarters, whispers of a man seen walking the upper halls. None dared say his name aloud, but everyone knew who it was meant to be. Colonel Thomas Beauregard, dead and buried, yet returning each night to climb the staircase he'd once built with slave labor and pride. Ruth saw him first, or what used to be him. His figure drifted past the widow's parlor, shoulders hunched, boots leaving no sound. The air behind him shimmered with cold, and the scent of river clay clung to her nostrils long after he vanished. His coat was open. His chest was hollow. When she told the cook, the woman crossed herself and whispered, "Don't say it. He'll know you saw him." The slaves began sleeping in shifts, afraid of what moved through the house when the lamps went out. Sometimes doors opened on their own. Other times the mirrors breathed, fogging from within. One man claimed he saw his reflection blink after he'd turned away. Meanwhile, the widow had grown gaunter, paler, her lips always moving as though in silent conversation. The servants heard her murmuring to the empty chair beside her husband's old desk. "I kept my promise," she'd say. "I opened the way." The overseer, desperate to restore order, confronted her one night near the chapel. He told her to end her madness, to free the terrified staff. The widow smiled, a slow, almost tender smile, and said, "Do you not understand, Mr. Duval? He never left. You're standing where he breathes." The next morning, the overseer's horse was found wandering the fields. The man himself was gone, leaving only his boots outside the chapel door, filled to the brim with mud the color of blood. From then on, no one dared speak the colonel's name. But every night the house trembled faintly, as if its walls remembered his footsteps returning home. It was a Saturday night when the widow summoned them, 6 slaves chosen without explanation. She stood in the doorway of the chapel, her face hidden beneath a black veil, and handed each of them a spade. The order was simple: dig until the earth breathes. Behind the chapel, beneath the magnolia trees, the ground was already soft, as though something had been buried and recently disturbed. The men dug in silence, afraid to look at one another. Every few minutes, the widow's voice drifted from the open chapel door, humming, chanting, whispering words that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. The deeper they went, the stranger the soil became. It was no longer brown but gray and cold, flecked with something like bone dust. The spades began striking wood, not a coffin but planks arranged in a perfect circle, carved with symbols none of them recognized. When they hesitated, the widow appeared beside them, barefoot, her dress dragging through the dirt. She placed her hand on the ground and whispered, "It's still warm." Then she turned to Ruth, who held the lantern, and said softly, "Light has no place here." The flame flickered out. What happened next lived only in nightmares. The men said the earth began to pulse slow and heavy, like a heartbeat beneath their feet. One screamed that something was moving below, pushing upward. Another dropped his spade and ran, but the widow's voice stopped him cold. You will not flee from resurrection. By dawn the pit was filled again. The men were ordered to say nothing. Yet one of them, before he died a week later, told Ruth he'd seen an eye open in the soil. An eye that blinked once and wept. After that night the house grew colder. The chapel's windows never went dark again, and Montgomery's richest widow had begun her first unholy Sabbath. Word of the widow's madness spread through Montgomery like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Even the church could not ignore it anymore. When whispers reached the pulpit of St. Paul's, Reverend Elijah Crane, a man of deep faith and deeper pride, resolved to confront her himself. No soul is too lost for the Lord, he declared. He rode to Clayborne Hill on a humid Sunday afternoon. The air was thick and sour, the mansion still as a tomb. The slaves refused to enter the chapel with him. They said the ground there listened. The widow greeted him at the door, thin as parchment, her eyes the pale gray of storm water. She thanked him for coming and offered tea that smelled faintly of iron. As they sat, the Reverend spoke of repentance and divine mercy. She listened politely, then said almost tenderly, "You speak of heaven as though it were somewhere else, Reverend, but I have seen it. It breathes beneath our feet," he frowned, rising to leave, but she insisted he witness her service. Against his better judgment, he followed her into the chapel. Inside, candles formed a circle around the altar. The floor glistened with dark liquid, too thick for oil, too warm for wax. The Reverend froze. The air pulsed. The widow stepped into the circle and began reciting words not found in any scripture he knew. The walls seemed to move with her voice, the very wood bending inward. Then came a second voice, not hers, low, rasping, male. It echoed his name, Elijah. The Reverend dropped his Bible. The pages turned black where they touched the floor. He stumbled backward, choking on the stench of blood and smoke. When he finally fled the house, his hair had gone white. He never preached again. Months later, when he died in his sleep, his last words to his wife were, "The sermon never ended." And from that night on, the chapel lights never dimmed. They throbbed faint and red like a pulse that refused to die. Winter came early that year, harsh and bone dry. The mansion's gardens turned to dust, the well water to rust. And one morning, as fog rolled off the river, a small figure appeared at the gate, a boy barefoot, no more than 7, clutching a bundle of cloth and a wooden toy carved in the shape of an eye. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The mark on his wrist, a faint circle with 3 crescents, told the slaves all they needed to know. He was brought in by the widow herself, who told them only, "He was sent to me." The boy's name was Elias. He did not speak, but he watched everything. The flicker of candles, the movements of the servants, the chapel door that no longer stayed shut. Sometimes he would sit for hours outside it, tracing invisible patterns in the dust. One night Ruth caught him drawing on the cellar wall with chalk. His pictures were crude but unmistakable. A woman kneeling before a man with no face, and beneath them, a spiral leading downward into the ground. When she tried to erase it, Elias looked up at her with eyes too old for his body and whispered, "She's calling him back." After that, the boy refused food. He would only drink water taken from the creek behind the chapel. The widow seemed proud, not worried. She began referring to him as "my vessel." Within a week, strange noises returned, laughter echoing through empty rooms, the sound of small feet running, though no children lived there. The slaves begged to leave, but none were permitted. On the 7th night, Elias vanished. In his bed lay only his wooden toy, split down the middle, and carved into the wall above it, written in the widow's own handwriting, were 4 words that made Ruth collapse to her knees. "The child has seen." The winter after Elias vanished was the last any of them remembered clearly. By spring, the fields had turned black, as if the soil itself had lost its will to grow. Half the servants were sold or fled into the woods, leaving only a handful to tend the widow's decaying estate. Among them was Ruth, the only one who still entered the house after dark. She did it out of duty or perhaps guilt. The others said she had the widow's mark on her hand, and the house would not let her go. Every night she would light a candle, whisper a prayer, and listen to the walls breathe. Then one evening she heard something under the floorboards again. But this time it wasn't the boys humming. It was her own name. When she lifted the loose plank, the air that escaped was freezing, foul with the scent of rot and flowers. In the hollow beneath lay a scrap of fabric, Elias's shirt, and beside it a human tooth, small and clean as if newly grown. The floor began to tremble, and for an instant she swore she saw the wood ripple like water. The widow appeared in the doorway, eyes burning with cold devotion. "You've disturbed his rest," she said softly. He was becoming. Ruth fled that night. She ran barefoot through the trees until the mansion's lights were swallowed by distance. No one in Montgomery ever saw her again until 10 years later. In 1855, a traveling preacher found her wandering the roads near Mobile, blind, barefoot, and humming that same backward hymn from the chapel. Her eyes were white as salt, and when he asked her what she'd seen, she smiled and said, "He finally learned to walk." Then she began to bleed from her palms, two thin streams, forming circles as they fell into the dust, and the preacher swore the earth drank it. In June of 1846, a physician from Georgia arrived at Clayborne Hill, Dr. Alaric Keene, known in Montgomery for his fascination with psychic afflictions and the anatomy of faith. He claimed he'd been summoned by the widow herself, who insisted she was suffering from a sickness of remembrance. The doctor's first entry, found years later among mold-stained pages, began simply, "She believes her husband's soul is trapped between worlds, and that her blood is the key." He described her as lucid, eloquent, and terrifyingly calm. Her skin bore fine cuts across the veins of her wrists and throat, but they were not self-inflicted. The wounds formed deliberate shapes symmetrical as script. When he asked who had marked her, she answered, "The hands of reunion." Over several nights, Keene recorded his observations. The house, he noted, had a rhythm, a deep, subtle vibration, as if the floorboards were breathing in time with a hidden organ. In the chapel, he witnessed the widow performing rites with the remaining servants, burning feathers, mixing blood with soil, and speaking a language that resembled the phonetics of reversed prayer. On the fifth night, he was awakened by the sound of water running beneath his bed. He followed it to the cellar, where he discovered a pool of blood forming in perfect concentric circles. Floating in the center was the boy's wooden toy, the carved eye. Keene's last entry is smeared, the ink warped as if written with trembling hands. She calls it the resurrection doctrine. Not to restore the dead, but to teach the living flesh to remember its former voice. She says the earth is the oldest body and it never forgets. The journal ends there. When neighbors came weeks later to find him, only his satchel remained, filled with bones too small to be human, each engraved with the widow's family crest, and carved into the inside of the bag's leather flap were 4 words, "The body is listening." By the autumn of 1846, whispers about Clayborne Hill reached the highest pews of Montgomery's clergy. The Reverend Crane was long confined to silence, but others in the congregation spoke of shadows moving in daylight, of the widow's name written backward in baptismal ledgers. The bishop declared that the devil had found a wife among us. They gathered 20 men, preachers, deacons, and hired guards, and rode to the estate one moonless night. They carried crosses, hymn books, and a barrel of lamp oil. They would purify the house of sin. When they reached the chapel, the door stood open. Candles burned inside, forming a ring around the altar. The widow knelt at its center, humming softly, her gown soaked to the hem in something dark. The men hesitated, for the air shimmered with heat, though the night was cold. One deacon whispered, "We are too late." The bishop raised his cross and shouted a prayer. The flame of the lanterns flared suddenly high, then turned red. The hymn on their lips faltered as the shadows on the walls began to move, not like reflections but like living things. The widow turned, her veil falling away. "You came to burn me," she said. "Then know what you light." She lifted her hands. The floor cracked open beneath the altar. A roar rose from the pit, not of wind, not of flame, but of breath vast and endless. The men fled in terror. By dawn the chapel was gone. Only its cross remained, still burning upright in the soil, though no fire touched it. In town, they said the bishop died the next day, coughing ash. His last words were written on a scrap of cloth found clutched in his hand. She was not praying. She was teaching the earth to listen. From then on, Clayborne Hill was left alone. But every Sunday night, Montgomery's church bells rang an extra toll for a soul that refused absolution. After the night the chapel burned, Clayborne Hill stood quiet for months. But silence in Montgomery was never peace, and it was warning. The fields around the mansion began to wither, their soil turning the color of bruised skin. Cotton stalks grew twisted, their bowls hollow as if the earth had forgotten how to give. Animals refused to cross the property line. The dogs that once barked at shadows now lay trembling and blind. The well water grew slick, leaving a metallic film that stained the hands of anyone who touched it. And each morning the slaves woke to find strange shapes in the soil, spirals, eyes, and what looked like handprints pressed from below. Those who tried to leave grew ill before they reached the river. Fevers came quickly, followed by dreams too vivid to survive. One woman swore she saw the widow's husband standing at her bedside, whispering, "Help me remember my name." When she woke, her mouth was filled with dirt. The overseer's replacement, a man named Calhoun Briggs, attempted to plow the north field, determined to prove the curse a lie. His mule dropped dead before noon. By sunset, Briggs was on his knees, bleeding from the eyes, muttering the same phrase over and over. "The ground is breathing. The ground is breathing." When word reached town, the locals began calling it the blight of Beauregard Hill. The church urged prayers. The farmers burned their crops in superstition. But the air above the estate still shimmered faintly red, as if the chapel's light had sunk into the soil itself. Ruth's old mark, the circle and crescents, began appearing on the trees, carved by no human hand. And at night, when the wind passed over the dead fields, it carried with it the faintest sound, not of rustling leaves, but of 1,000 voices humming beneath the earth. The house had gone quiet, but the land was learning to speak. By the spring of 1847, what had once been the chapel of Clayborne Hill was nothing more than a sinkhole, a mouth in the earth that refused to close. Rainwater poured into it endlessly, yet it never filled. Children dared each other to throw stones into the pit, but no sound ever returned. Scholars from Tuskegee rode out to investigate. They measured the depression, took samples of the soil, and declared it the result of natural subsidence. But one of them, Professor Wills, was found days later in the river, his body contorted as if bent backward by unseen hands. A note was found in his coat pocket, written in smudged ink. "There is something beneath. It listens. It repeats." Locals began to speak of the hollow ground, a place where prayers went downward instead of up. A plantation boy, desperate to find his lost sister, claimed to have heard her voice echoing from the hole. He threw a lantern in, and for an instant the depths flickered with light. Those who stood nearby swore they saw the faint outline of a staircase spiraling beneath the soil. After that night, no one approached it again. The field around the pit grew slick with a gray moss that smelled faintly of blood. Birds avoided the sky above it, flying wide circles as if something invisible hung there. The widow, seen rarely now, walked the property barefoot at dusk, humming hymns no one recognized. She carried a silver basin and poured black water along the pit's edge as though feeding it. Some claimed the pit answered her, not in sound but in the trembling of the ground, subtle but rhythmic, as if something below was breathing in time with her song. The townsfolk spoke her name less and less. Not out of fear of her, but fear that the earth itself might be listening. And by midsummer, even the mapmakers erased Clayborne Hill from their charts, as if it had never been there at all. It began on the night of August 3rd, 1847. No thunder, no wind, only a strange stillness that pressed against the town like a weight. Every lamp dimmed, though no oil had run out. And across Montgomery, from the lowest tenement to the governor's house, every soul who slept shared the same dream. They saw a black sky with no stars. Beneath it, the red fields of Clayborne Hill stretched endless and bare. In the center stood the widow, her face veiled, her hands clasped over her heart. Behind her rose a staircase spiraling into the ground, built of pale stone slick with what looked like tears. One by one, the dreamers found themselves walking toward her, unable to stop. Her voice filled their ears, calm and tender, saying, "Come see what your silence has built." As each dreamer reached the top of the stairs, they looked down into the spiral and saw their own houses, their families, their churches, all turning slowly beneath the soil like toys in a glass jar. 100 whispered prayers rose at once, but none reached heaven. Then the widow lifted her veil, and every dreamer awoke screaming. By morning, 7 people were dead. Their hearts had simply stopped. Dozens more were struck mute, unable to speak or recall their own names. The town doctor called it shared hysteria, but those who survived said they could still hear her humming when they closed their eyes, a tune that made the blood in their ears throb like a second heartbeat. The bishop's successor ordered the churches to ring their bells every midnight for a week, to cleanse the air. But each time the bells rang, they echoed twice, once in the steeple, and once from underground. And from that night forward, no one in Montgomery dared to sleep in silence. For silence, they now knew, could dream too. By the winter of 1847, Montgomery's streets no longer felt like home. The air held that faint iron taste of coming rain, though no clouds ever formed. Every mirror in town had been draped in cloth. People whispered that if you looked too long into your own reflection, you might see her veil moving behind you. It was the night of St. Luke's Vigil, when they said the widow returned. No one saw her arrive. They only heard the sound first, a low procession of footsteps echoing through Clay Street, steady and deliberate, though no horse nor carriage stirred. From every window, townsfolk peered out and saw them, figures in black veils, each carrying a small candle cupped against the wind. There were 12 of them, and leading them was the widow herself. Her veil shimmered as if lit from beneath. Those who watched swore she walked above the ground, her shadow bending the light around it. When she reached the courthouse square, she stopped, turned toward the crowd gathering in silent awe, and said only, "The covenant was never broken." You broke the silence. No one dared respond. A child cried, and the sound seemed to echo far too long. Then the procession began to hum, that same wordless melody from the dream. Windows shuddered. The gas lamps flickered blue. Some felt their knees weaken. Others wept without knowing why. When the last candle dimmed, the veiled figures vanished. No footprints, no smoke, only a trail of melted wax that led north, toward Clayborne Hill. By morning, half the town's clocks had stopped at the same moment, 2:13 a.m. The mayor sealed the record books that day. He forbade all mention of the widow in public prayer. But silence had become useless. The name had already rooted itself in every tongue. In the weeks that followed, black veils appeared again, hanging from porches, church pews, even trees by the road. No one confessed to placing them there. It was as if Montgomery itself had joined the procession. In early 1848, when the air still carried the echo of the widow's procession, the Church of St. Luke received an order from Montgomery's council. Every record from the last 20 years was to be reviewed. Births, baptisms, deaths, especially those tied to the Beauregard estate. The task fell to one man, Elias Harrow, the parish archivist. A quiet scholar, nearly blind from years of candlelight study, Harrow lived in the basement of the rectory surrounded by parchment, ink, and dust. He was known to sleep beside the records he transcribed, as if guarding the dead, they said. At first, the ledgers appeared ordinary, but by the third week, Harrow noticed something strange. Pages from the years 1840 through 1845 had been removed, their gaps neatly sewn shut with black thread. In the margins, faint indentations remained, as though someone had written and then scraped away the ink with a blade. He began holding the pages to candlelight. And there, under the thin parchment, ghost lines emerged. Not names but symbols, circles crossed by crescents, the same marks once carved into Clayborne Hill's trees. On the 12th night of his search, Harrow found a single intact entry written in an unsteady hand. It read, "For the sins unspoken, 12 souls were promised to silence." Below it, in the same ink, someone had drawn a veil. The next morning, the bishop found Harrow's workspace abandoned. His chair overturned, his candle still burning low. Only one new note was left upon the table, scrawled hastily in red wax and not ink. "They are not dead. They are catalogued." When the council reopened the records, every name from Clayborne Hill had vanished, even from copies in the courthouse, as if the families, the servants, the children had never existed. But some swore that, if you listened to the church walls at night, you could hear the faint scratching of a quill on paper, continuing the list line by line, as if the records were still being written, and no one ever saw Elias Harrow again. By the summer of 1848, something new began to stir in Montgomery, not in the soil nor in the churches, but in the children. It started as whispers during lessons at the parish school. Miss Tillman, the teacher, said they began humming softly during prayers, a tune she could not place. Then one morning she caught the youngest, 6-year-old Abigail Reed, reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly, but in reverse. Word spread fast. Parents forbade their children from speaking after dark. Some locked them in their rooms with rosaries and hymn books, yet each dawn they woke to find strange words, scrawled on the walls in chalk. Or ash, words that read normally only when reflected in a mirror. The town doctor called it mimetic sleep disorder. The pastor called it a trial from God. But the elders whispered of the widow's promise that silence itself was the covenant. And now the covenant had been broken. Soon the affliction spread. Infants cooed in deep tones no mother could recognize. A group of boys were found digging near the old road to Clayborne Hill, saying they were building stairs for the choir below. When questioned, they could not recall why. One night Miss Tillman awoke to a tapping sound outside her window. The children stood there in the fog, barefoot, each wearing a black scrap of cloth tied over their mouths. When she opened the door, they spoke as one. "The records are full. We must make room." She fainted before they finished. By morning, the children had returned home, asleep in their beds, as if nothing had happened. But every parent found the same thing in their child's hand, a small circle drawn in soot, surrounded by 3 crescents. It was the mark of the widow. And that day, for the first time in months, the earth around Clayborne Hill began to breathe again. By late 1848, Montgomery's heart was hollowed by dread. The bells of St. Luke's had not rung for weeks. Each time the rope was pulled, the clapper froze mid-swing as if caught in unseen hands. Then, on the first Sunday of Advent, the church filled again, drawn not by faith but by fear. The pews were packed when the first tremor ran through the floorboards. At first it sounded like distant thunder, then like breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from beneath the stone nave. The Reverend Crane's successor tried to continue his sermon, voice cracking, "The Lord tests." But the words drowned in the rising hum that no mouth was making. Candles flared white. Plaster began to fall from the vaulted ceiling. Parishioners rushed for the doors only to find them locked, not by bolt or hand, but by the air itself, thick and unmoving. A low moan rolled through the building, every window pane vibrating in sympathy. Witnesses later swore that the floor bowed inward, as though the church were being swallowed by its own foundation. The great crucifix above the altar tilted forward, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the walls. Then, without a crash or explosion, the entire center aisle simply sank, quietly, gracefully, like a ship disappearing beneath black water. When the sound ceased, the church stood whole again. Yet the pews where 50 people had sat were now empty. No debris, no bodies, just smooth stone, warm to the touch. By dawn, faint singing drifted from beneath the church, the same tune heard in every nightmare since the widow's rise. Those who listened too long forgot their own names for a moment, as if the hymn were tugging at something deep inside them. That night, the town sealed the church with iron chains. But travelers passing Montgomery still claimed that, when the moon hung red and low, the bell of St. Luke's rang once, not from the steeple, but from underneath the ground. Winter of 1849 came early and hard. Frost glazed the windows of empty houses, and the smoke from Montgomery's chimneys rose thin and crooked, as if reluctant to leave the ground. The town still existed, but in a way that felt like memory wearing flesh. Only a handful of people remained who could remember the widow's name, and even they spoke it as if it were not sound but burden. In February, a surveyor from Mobile arrived to map the region for the railroad. He found the church chained shut, the courthouse windows bricked, and Clayborne Hill fenced off with rusted wire. Yet on the widow's estate, inside a single surviving room, he discovered a desk untouched by dust. Upon it lay a ledger, its pages brittle but perfectly legible. The entries began like any plantation record: names, dates, harvest notes. But further in, the handwriting changed. It slanted sharply, each word curling backward as if resisting being read. The final page contained only one sentence, written in ink that shimmered faintly under the surveyor's lantern. The 13th year is complete. The soil remembers. The silence will hold. Below it, pressed into the paper, was a handprint, too small to be hers, yet unmistakably human. The surveyor left the ledger in Montgomery's town office and returned south. Weeks later, his report arrived sealed and unsigned. It contained a map of Alabama with one detail missing: the name Montgomery. In its place was a blank space bordered by faint circular lines like ripples where something had sunk. No train ever reached the city. No records after that year mention its fall. The widow's estate vanished from deed and scripture alike. But travelers crossing the Central Plain still speak of a night when the wind turns warm in winter, carrying the scent of candle smoke and iron. They say, if you listen closely, you can hear pages turning in the dark. A ledger being written still by hands that never stopped.